what is your position on the other term in here, which is whether it can be deauthorized, authorization versus deauthorized? Deauthorized. What's the difference between there, and how do we distinguish between whether the revocability or deauthorization nature of it?
Yeah, so I think in order to answer that question, we kind of have to take a step back and look at kind of the origins of the OGL. The OGL, because that notion of an authorized version really is a consequence of the OGL having been inspired by, and I think in large part in its drafting, guided by open source software licenses, right? Like that notion of authorization is something that you often find in open source software licenses, where the idea kind of was you would have multiple iterations of a license, which had been created by some kind of, let's call it a governing body, like some committee or organization or some collective of people who would be drafting the license and then iterating the license over time. When the open game license talks about authorization, and it only talks about authorization, right? It doesn't talk about deauthorization. I'll get back to that in a second. When the open game license talks about authorized versions, sort of in light of how open source software licenses have functioned and have been drafted and interpreted over the years, what I believe they are referring to is this notion that WotC could have, or whoever else was sort of identified as the steward of the license, could have created future versions of the license, future iterations of the license, which would have been quote unquote authorized, meaning that they were kind of in line with the original 1.0 of the license. What they were concerned about was people coming up with versions of the license which were fake, for lack of a better term, right? So somebody sort of creates a new version of the license, and they insert, a new term which WotC would never have contemplated or would not have countenanced. That would have been an unauthorized version of the license. And so when the OGL 1.0 is using the word authorized version, they're saying, look, you can use future versions of this license which come from the definitive, the authoritative source of the license. So let me go back to what we were talking about a second ago, which was deauthorization. Deauthorization, like, so far as I know, isn't really a thing, right? Like, there's no sort of concept in contract law. I mean, the concept of authorization in the first place doesn't really apply to contract law. But there's no concept of deauthorization. Like, it's sort of a meaningless term in a lot of ways, right? Like, I don't know what it means for somebody to say, well, I'm deauthorizing the contract. Like, that kind of a gobbledygook to a certain extent, right? I can sit there and say a license is either an authorized version, meaning it came from the authoritative source for the license, or somebody can say it's an unauthorized version, meaning it didn't come from the authoritative source. But I don't know what it means to say that somebody is deauthorizing a contract or a license.
Well, that kind of forks into two things here. That now Ryan Dancing, when we were talking to him, he was saying that that he put the authorization license in there specifically. He said that he was talking about previous drafts. He was trying to make clear that if he circulated a draft that, hey, I'm thinking about putting this out, what do you think? Please submit for commentary, whatever, that there were all kinds of drafts or whatever circulating among people that he was sending them to, and that he wanted to be clear that those you can't publish under.
Mm-hmm.
That there's going to be something that is authorization, which is something like officially publishing on the WotC website or something like that. And then now we have an authorized version. You can't publish under something we were thinking about.
Right. Yeah, it's that notion of like the sort of the authoritative version, right? Like the version that has been blessed and approved and authorized by the source, right? And so exactly to his point, what you don't want to have is a situation where you have multiple competing versions of the open game license, and there's ambiguity or uncertainty as to, well, which one is the quote unquote real open source or open game license, right? Which one is the authorized open game license? And so in order to answer that question, you sort of look back through the stream and you say, okay, well, this was the version that WotC had promulgated. This was the version that they published and said, this is the authoritative version. This is the authorized version of the license. So that notion of authorized version applies both to like pre-existing drafts, as Dancy referred to, and future iterations of the license. Because I think that's, so my understanding, and I think Ryan would agree with this, I think there was some kind of notion that there were going to be multiple iterations of the OGL over time, right? It wasn't going to be a static license, which just sat there and sort of didn't evolve at all. And so, you know, like I think there were conversations, and I think I touch on this in the dissertation, I think there were conversations about potentially modifying the license to, you know, clarify how it would apply to things like video games or use in software.
Or patents. You were talking about patents.
Yeah. So I don't know that there was ever an intention that the OGL 1.0a was going to be like the sort of quote unquote final version that was going to exist for 20 plus years. I think there was a notion that it was going to change over time. For whatever reason, that just didn't end up happening. Right. So when we talk about an authorized version of the license, what we mean is like the 1.0a, which was published by WotC and sort of blessed by WotC as being the definitive version of the OGL.
In that vein, then, going forward, because you had mentioned in the interview that you had done previously, talking about why is it that Wizards of the Coast has copyright to the OGL itself? And I put that question to Ryan Dancy. Like, why? Because it seems, you brought up that it seems strange that you have copyright to it, but in order to use it, you have to copy it. And he said that basically to protect against kind of things you were saying, that he was saying he wanted Wizards of the Coast to have the copyright to that, to prevent somebody else from just copying the verbiage of the license and then adding some other word or something else. And then there'd be all this confusion about what OGL are you talking about?
Yeah, that makes sense to me, right? Like I think I understand the intention there. You know, whether that mechanism works perfectly, I think we can sort of discuss, but certainly it makes sense to me that that's another or sort of the primary way that WotC would have exercised control over the terms of the license itself. Now, as you alluded to in the previous interview, I mean, I sort of pointed out like it's an odd kind of assertion of copyright because by its very nature, the OGL is going to be copied lots and lots and lots of times without, you know, any notice to WotC or any knowledge on their part that it's being copied. So I sort of think of that as that's kind of like this weird sort of fail-safe arrow in the quiver that they kept, you know, in case there was some kind of weird breakdown in the process where somebody was trying to promulgate like a, you know, a rogue version of the OGL.